Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started so that we can respect everybody's time this evening. I wanted to welcome you to CureSHANK's Fall 2022 Community Webinar. If you don't know me, I am Talia Emery Silva. I am a CureSHANK board member. I work primarily with communications. We are thrilled to see so many people here from the Phelan-McDermid syndrome community at this very important informational webinar. We mentioned in our spring webinar that one of our main projects this year was organizing what's called an externally led patient-focused drug development, or EL-PFDD meeting. This is an exciting initiative that will come to fruition on November 8th. And that is what this webinar is primarily about. You are going to learn tonight how this EL-PFDD meeting serves as a unique opportunity to share with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, your loved one's story of living with PMS. It doesn't matter where you live or where you are in your journey. What matters is your family's story. The primary goal of the EL-PFDD is to hear directly from patients and caregivers about their perspectives on living with PMS and with various treatments, with the goal of improving the development of new treatments in the research pipeline. The patient perspective is critical in helping the FDA understand the context in which regulatory decisions are made for new drugs. Now, please note that I said that this is going to be on November 8th, which is easy to remember because it is election day. It's also perhaps easier to forget for the same reason that it is election day. And so please plan to vote early so that you can participate as much as possible in the EL-PFDD meeting. Before we get started, we want to thank our EL-PFDD sponsors, Jaguar Gene Therapy and Neuron Pharmaceuticals. These are two companies that care deeply about finding treatments for PMS and are generously helping make this EL-PFDD meeting a success. A few notes of webinar housekeeping. Today's webinar is scheduled to last about an hour. Everybody should be muted to allow speakers to present without interruptions. Also, this webinar is being recorded, so it will be available for later viewing, and you will receive information via email and social media about how to access the recording. If you have questions during the webinar, please use your Q&A chat box at the bottom of the screen, and our team will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. Okay, so what we always do at these webinars is we provide updates on what's going on. Now, number one on there, you see the main subject of this webinar is definitely the EL-PFDD meeting. That's what we're going to spend the vast majority of our time on. But we just had a few updates on some of our other projects, and then we also wanted to make some introductions. Number two on there, we have made a lot of progress with the extensive legwork involved in putting together our Biomarkers and Outcome Measures Consortium. This is a consortium of companies that are developing or are interested in developing treatments for SHANK3 dysfunction. The consortium will enable them to collaborate on projects of mutual benefit that improve how we can measure the success of potential treatments, which is critical to the approval and success of clinical trials. We will share more about the CureSHANK Consortium in future webinars. Just wanted you to know that it's underway. Also, number three, we wanted to briefly remind you our completed project, the PMS conceptual model, is available to view and download as a PDF on our website. If you want to learn more about what a conceptual model is, why it's important, et cetera, we covered that thoroughly in our last webinar, and very soon we're going to be getting recordings of our past webinars up on our website. Finally, number four, we wanted to share with you the newest addition to our Real Family Stories for Patient-Focused Drug Development video series. These short videos highlight specific symptoms of PMS by focusing on the story of an individual with PMS and are designed to be used by any party seeking to communicate the high level of unmet medical need in our community. Our previous videos highlighted regression and self-injurious behaviors. This newest video is mainly about hypotonia, and many of you will recognize this beautiful little girl.
Happy birthday Happy birthday to you. And many more. We love you. Avonlea will never be able to talk, and I don't know that she'll be able to walk. My youngest was diagnosed with Phelan-McDermid syndrome when she was a year old. Avonlea was missing milestones very early on. We really struggled to nurse. She wasn't sitting. She wasn't reaching for objects. We were referred to genetics around 10 months old, and that is what resulted in us getting a Phelan-McDermid syndrome diagnosis. Phelan-McDermid syndrome consists of hypotonia, epilepsy. A lot of children have trouble toileting, sleeping. Most children are nonverbal. More. You did say more. Good job. She is most affected by her severe hypotonia. When Avonlea is not actively using her muscles, she's like Jell-O. She has never been able to stand on her own or walk. She struggles even to roll over. It has affected her entire GI tract. In order for her to have a bowel movement correctly, I give her suppository every night. She does not urinate on her own. She's also on 2 different seizure medications. We're about to start a 3rd. The side effects are pretty awful. They cause excessive drowsiness, muscle fatigue. They have also caused her to have a severe case of osteopenia. This has resulted in 2 leg breaks in the last 2 years. Our fears for the future almost always revolve around seizures. This month alone, she's had 19. Sudden, unexpected death in epilepsy is very scary, and it happens very often. In so many ways, Avonlea is like any other neurotypical child. She communicates very well with her facial expressions. You never have to question what she's thinking. She is the sweetest, giggliest little cuddle monster. When we cuddle on the couch together, you forget about all of the things you have to do for the rest of the day. All of the scary stuff just goes away, and she's just my sweet little Avonlea. CureSHANK's mission to raise research funding to help find a cure for Phelan-McDermid syndrome means that we could have a medication or a therapy to help children like Avonlea. It means the world to me and to my family. I often get asked how I find the strength to live this life the way that I do. I get strength from Avonlea. She has the strength to get through what she does. I have the strength to help her.
It's such a powerful video and always gets me in tears. We are so grateful for Lacey and the whole Byron family for engaging in the always emotional process of making a video like this. And we're also grateful for PMS dad Bill Bergen, father of Hudson, for his always excellent work producing videos like this for us. We also appreciate the role of the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation that they have played in helping recruit families to participate in this EL-PFDD and also helping spread the word about it. In that vein, we have asked Kate Still, scientific director at the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation, to join us this evening and say a few words. Kate joined PMSF last year, so not all of you have had the chance to meet her. She has a PhD in neuroscience and has experience in neuroscience research and biotechnology. Her passion is communicating science to a range of audiences on neuroscience topics. She serves as the PMSF scientific director, is the chair of their scientific advisory committee, and the principal investigator of the PMS Data Hub. She's passionate about progress for families and is focused on projects aimed at accelerating research in PMS. And she just wanted to say a few words this evening.
Thank you so much, Talia. And that video was truly powerful and beautiful. So happy to be here. I'll be really quick. So we're really happy to be supporting this project. And one of the things that we often get asked by families is where each of our projects fit into the overall goal of finding new therapies and drug development for Phelan-McDermid syndrome. So one of the things that we're really working on right now at PMSF is to provide more visualization of what this looks like in terms of a roadmap and in terms of sharing specific details about some of the projects that we're working on as they come about. So Talia, if you wouldn't mind clicking next. Thank you. So I won't get into any of these specifically. They will all be on our website with specific summaries, but I just wanted to highlight that each of these areas, each of these major pillars are really important, and we feel like we're supporting all of them equally, starting with clinical support, which is just helping you all manage day to day, with any challenges, basic research, which I think is a lot more exciting than it sounds, because it's about finding new pathways and finding new things about the disorder that can often lead to breakthrough clinical trials later. And we're doing a lot of that through grant funding and clinical research. Always important to characterize the Phelan-McDermid syndrome population further and understand what helps and what works for things like neuropsych or GI, and linking genes with phenotype. But the number one thing I want to focus on is clinical trial readiness. This means a lot of things. This means not only having resources and the ability to get families to clinical trials, but it also means engaging pharma. Are we able to provide them with the data they need to be invested in our syndrome? And also bringing your voice forward to pharma. And I think this is where this project fits. The EL-PFDD is the last bullet point there. And we're thankful to be along for the ride on this. And we think it's really important to bring your voice forward, because all of these things funnel into more clinical trials and better design clinical trials that reflect what's important to you. So thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to see you all here.
Great, thank you. All right, so now we are going to get to the meat of this evening. I am pleased to introduce to you the two people who will be leading the remainder of this webinar, Larry Bauer and James Valentine from Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, who have been helping us plan our EL-PFDD over the past few months. James has worked the last 13 years as a champion for the patient voice as part of the regulatory process. He previously worked at the FDA, where he was a patient liaison, helping incorporate the patient voice into medical product review across the FDA's various medical product centers and review divisions. There, he helped to develop and launch the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative, of which EL-PFDD meetings like ours are a part. Larry worked at the NIH for 17 years in clinical research, followed by a position at the FDA as a regulatory scientist in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research's Rare Diseases Program. This was a group he co-founded and worked at for 10 years, where he advanced rare disease drug development. Now in private practice, James and Larry have worked with many patient organizations to ensure their community's voices were heard by decision makers. And particularly relevant to our EL-PFDD meeting, they have been involved in helping plan and moderate 3/4 of the over 65 externally led PFDD meetings that have taken place since the program began. So we are in very good hands with James and Larry, and I am going to turn it over to them now. I think I need to stop sharing my screen.
Great. Can we just confirm that you do see the slides?
Oh, great.
Perfect. Well, thank you for the kind introduction, and it's great to be with everybody. My name is James Valentine, and I'm here with my colleague Larry Bauer. You'll be hearing from him a little bit later, and we're really excited to be working with this community to help plan and ultimately organize this externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. As you heard, Larry and I both worked at FDA and saw and know the value that this your input has into drug development and regulatory decisions. And so our goal for this rest of this webinar tonight is to give you the information that you all will need to be able to participate in this meeting in an effective way. But maybe before we start even getting into some of that specific information we want to share, we want to start at a high level, giving you a sense of what it is that we're even talking about when we're talking about a patient-focused drug development meeting like this. So the purpose of this meeting is to convene, as many voices as possible from the PMS community to help educate the FDA as well as other stakeholders like those developing drugs to help them understand what it is to live with PMS, how PMS has impacted you and your loved ones' lives, how you and your loved ones are currently managing PMS, and what meaningful therapies would look like for you. These might seem like very straightforward things, but the truth is when you read a medical journal article or a textbook, you're not going to really understand what life is like, 365 days a year, 24/7. It's going to focus on what is captured in a clinic visit, which is only a few minutes in a day relative to what life really looks like. And so we really need to fill in the gaps of what and paint that picture very much like what we saw with that video a little earlier. So why should you participate? Well, this is a really unique opportunity to have your voices heard directly by the decision makers who will be attending this nearly all-day meeting. The FDA is the agency in the United States that approves all treatments. And so they need to know what's important to you. We don't want that, to have them need to, try to understand, maybe borrow from what they know for other conditions. We need them to know what's important to you and, specifically and in a nuanced way, so they can make more informed decisions. And, this knowledge will, in fact, inform their decision making. And the goal is to help lead to better and maybe even potentially faster approvals for PMS treatments. And you might be wondering why now? This community has been around for a long time. The FDA has been around for a long time. Well, unfortunately, historically, the patient's voice has not been a major part of the drug development process. It wasn't until, a drug was approved by the FDA and there was sometimes a realization that maybe the things that were measured in clinical trials didn't really align with what's important to patients or their caregivers. Or even worse, a clinical trial was failing and the drug company and FDA needed input to try to understand why that is. Was it because we were measuring the wrong things, or was it because the drug didn't actually work? Sometimes it's hard to unpack some of that. And you don't want to, have a program for a drug that might work, stop going through the development process just because of maybe some, improvements that could have been made to the trial design. And so recognizing that, there was a recognition within the FDA that your voices should be heard, not only at the end of the process, but throughout the process, early and often. And so this has really become a priority for the FDA. And that's why when Larry and I were both there, we helped initiate and launch this program, with the idea of more systematically being able to hear about the impact of different diseases on patients' lives, both directly from patients and their direct caregivers. And I'll use that as also a moment to just apologize in advance. Sometimes I might default to say the patient voice or refer to patients participating in this type of meeting. And what we really do mean is patients and caregivers, those that have that direct experience in daily life, living with and understanding the condition. So with kind of that high level overview and the remaining of our time, we're going to walk through a couple of key areas that we think really will help each and every one of you in participating in this meeting, or maybe if you're tuned in and you're not sure whether you should participate or if this is the right fit. Hopefully this will give you the information that will let you know that, this is a great opportunity for you. We'll start by giving you some background on drug development and regulatory decision-making. This may be a refresher for some of you, but we think it's important to kind of have everyone have a foundational understanding of the roles that FDA plays and some roles that they don't play in drug development. Once we explore that, we're going to talk a little bit about PFDD overall and where the patient's voice fits in to that drug development and FDA decision-making framework. And then we'll continue to get more specific and actually talk about the meeting itself, how it's organized, how you'll be able to be participating in that, and even share some tips on how to do so. So I'm going to start with this first part where we want to give you this background on FDA and drug development. And then I'll pass it over to my colleague Larry to walk us through the parts on patient engagement. So when we're talking about drug development, we first want to understand what is the process through which a drug is tested, such that we can ultimately evaluate the safety and effectiveness of the product, because ultimately that's the goal. And what FDA ultimately has to conclude is that the benefits of a drug outweigh the risks. And so those stages of testing actually really start before testing. There's an investment that happens early on that we refer to as drug discovery, where we're looking at and doing basic science research to really understand the disease and the disease process. So that way we can hopefully identify opportunities to where we might have a therapy that could intervene, maybe help interrupt or slow down a disease process, maybe reverse a disease process. But the first thing we need to know is we need to have a really good understanding of the disease itself. And so sometimes we may be able to take existing treatments, maybe things that are even approved for completely different diseases or related conditions, that have effects that might help in that treat, our disease. Or maybe we can develop really targeted and novel treatment approaches, specifically to treat a disease. But either way, it's once we have that promising compound that we can then begin the actual process of testing and evaluating the safety and effectiveness of the drug. So the first stage of doing that is what's called preclinical development, which means exactly what that word stands for, which is before going into the clinic or before human testing. And so in this stage, we're working and evaluating through different types of laboratory, you can almost think of it as like Petri dish type experiments, as well as animal studies that allow us to first assess whether the product is reasonably safe for initial human use. That's done through what are called toxicology studies, as well as if we have animal models or relevant disease models in animals that allow us to see, is the drug having the type of impact that we would expect it to have on the disease. Maybe we can even see, if the animal model, kind of looks like the disease in terms of symptoms and other health effects. We can actually see if the drug does treat it, the disease symptoms in that animal model. And those are called pharmacology studies. So it's through those toxicology and pharmacology studies that we get to have this sense of what doses of drugs are going to be active as well as toxic. And we're trying to find doses that are reasonably safe to take into clinical trials. So once we have those non-clinical studies completed, we can consider them going into clinical trials. And the way that we do that is through an investigational new drug application, or IND, which is an actual submission to the FDA. And in this submission, this is what enables us to where we're actually proposing and hopefully will enable us to go into our first in human study. So, the drug developer will compile all of its pharmacology and toxicology study information. Also, a third important prong to what FDA is always evaluating is, in addition to drug safety and effectiveness, also the drug's quality. So we want to make sure that when a drug is manufactured, whether it's for a clinical trial or eventually when it's approved and being produced in much larger sizes and amounts to be able to treat all patients, that it's manufactured in a high quality way. We want to make sure that there's not impurities that are going to be harmful. We want to make sure that there's the right amount, not too little, not too much of the different ingredients. So that way, it'll have a consistent effect of what is seen in clinical trials. And so that manufacturing information is also provided to FDA, as well as the proposal for that first trial, often a phase 1 clinical trial, which is evaluated at the same time. If FDA says that the study may proceed, then we can go into our phase 1 testing. Phase 1 clinical trials in rare diseases most often are in people living with the condition. but sometimes can still be in healthy volunteers, so people without the condition that are volunteering to take the drug just to kind of see its safety profile. Really, though, either way, in phase 1, we have a big emphasis on the drug safety. These studies are the shortest and smallest studies that are conducted, and that allows us to just see those most common side effects. And by seeing those most common side effects, we can see if we have a, too high of a dose. If we are doing this study in people living with the condition, we may be able to look at some laboratory values, other types of biomarkers to see, if we have a drug that's having, the intended effect biologically, at least. And even if we don't have that type of information, we can at least make sure that the drug's getting to the right parts of the body. It's staying in the body long enough for it to have the effect that's expected. See how it leaves the body. That type of information about the drug's metabolism and excretion is really valuable as well. And so once we have that information and we see that, some number of doses, are safe in humans at the way that they're administered, we can then move into what are called phase 2 clinical trials. And these phase 2 trials are unlike phase 1, where sometimes you have healthy volunteers. Phase 2 trials are always conducted in people with the condition. And here because of that, we can begin to evaluate the drug's effectiveness. So does the drug actually treat, the symptoms, the health effects, how people are able to function, or even mortality in a trial. And so in a phase 2 trial, we're just starting to do this. So we're trying to do what's called proof of concept, which is just that initial evidence to help us know that we are having the intended effect. These studies are a little bit longer. They can be, out to a year in duration for chronic conditions, but they can also be shorter than that. We, again, can start to evaluate some of those endpoints that measure the drug's benefit. We also, because these studies are a little larger and longer, can start to do some controlled comparisons. So we can include a control group. The most common one that's known is a placebo control group, where people are on, the quote unquote sugar pill. So people in the study don't know if they're assigned to the drug or to the placebo. That helps us understand what's a real drug effect versus, what is commonly referred to as the placebo effect. All at the same time, even if when we're evaluating some of that proof of concept drug benefit information, we're very much still evaluating the drug safety. We may be evaluating different doses, so we're trying to find the sweet spot of what is both, providing that early evidence that the drug works, but at the same time being tolerable and not introducing unnecessary risk. So once we've done that and we again, confirm that the drug is, has that proof of concept efficacy, it's got promise, then we want to actually, establish the drug benefit profile. And that is done in what's called a phase 3 trial. And if you've read, press releases, news articles, generally, kind of the common parlance is to refer to this sometimes as a pivotal trial or a registration trial. These are the largest, longest clinical trials. These are always controlled trials. There are other kinds of controls other than placebo controls, but we do, in these phase 3 trials, almost always have a control group. Because these are larger and longer, it allows us to assess some things that we weren't able to assess in phase 2 studies. We can start looking at the duration of the effect, because as we follow people longer, we can see how durable the effect is. We can, because the studies are larger, actually break out into different subgroups to see they're kind of big enough now to start to look to see if we have different benefit or risk profiles. It could be anything from by age, by sex, by disease severity, any number of things, to see if those are factors that impact the benefits and risks. And again, we can continue to be evaluating, even in phase 3, multiple doses of a product. Also, because these are larger and longer studies, we can start to pick up on some of the less common safety events or side effects. The more people that you have and the more doses that they get, if it's a drug that is dosed more than once, you can then begin to kind of see, what are some of the less common things that people might experience. It also allows you in this larger context to evaluate how the investigational drugs being tested in the study might interact with some of the more common drugs that are used in the patient population. Now, I describe these as 3 discrete phases of product development. In rare diseases, a lot of the time these phases are combined. In some cases, it may even be a single phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trial. More commonly would be combining, phase 1/2 or phase 2/3. But most usually, unlike in very common or prevalent conditions, you're dealing with a single phase 3 study instead of needing to have 2 of those big, long studies. And that's kind of where, because every patient is precious, there's not a lot of people to participate in trials. There's less of an expectation that 2 will be conducted. So once all of that information is complete, the drug developer can then consider submitting a marketing application to the FDA. For a drug, this would be called a new drug application or NDA. For a biological product like a vaccine, a cell or gene therapy, an enzyme replacement or protein replacement, there's a lot of different things that fall under biological products. That's submitted under a biologics license application or BLA. They're essentially the same. They're just created under different laws. And if a company's thinking, okay, we think we have enough to establish the drug benefit and risk profiles, and that benefit profile outweighs the risk profile, but they can go into FDA and have what's called a pre-NDA or a pre-BLA meeting, where they lay out that evidence. They kind of discuss, how they analyzed that data. And it allows an opportunity to, kind of say, are there really any major gaps that maybe some additional investigation or additional analyses could help address before you come in with the NDA or BLA? Or, it may be, that it's more of a discussion of, hey, we'd like you to include certain additional analyses or organize things in a different way to make it easier for us at FDA to do our review. So then when an NDA or a BLA is submitted, it's really a compilation of everything we've talked about. It's not just the phase 3 information. It's the preclinical studies, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Everything is submitted, and it's not just the summaries either. It's the actual underlying data. In the United States, the FDA actually wants to be able to do their own analyses of the data and not just be limited to what's, the outputs of the analyses done by the company that's submitting the marketing application. So it's a huge amount of data that gets submitted to the FDA. And once it's there, it comes through this as this NDA or BLA. FDA first looks at it, make sure it's complete. Before they spend the resources to actually do a review, they want to make sure it's got all the parts and pieces needed to, check all the different regulatory boxes that need to be checked. If it's deficient, they can refuse to file the application. If it's got all the information, they can file the application. Once it's filed, they then start the real review. During that review time, which can be between 6 to 10 months, depending on how FDA designates the application as either a priority or standard review. They're then looking at the effectiveness, the safety, and as I mentioned before, the manufacturing quality. So these are all things that FDA is evaluating as they're conducting their review. If FDA has questions, things that maybe aren't straightforward, maybe there's a new scientific issue that comes up because of the nature of a data package or a technology that's used for treatment, or maybe it's just a hard call. FDA can convene what's called an advisory committee. These advisory committees are made up of experts, clinical experts, research experts, biostatisticians, but also patient representatives that all have a voice and a vote. Ultimately, though, these are advisory committees, so that whatever they vote and whatever they say is just advice that the FDA then takes into account. And ultimately, FDA still has to make the final approval decision. And they may not, make a decision that aligns with the advice they receive from an advisory committee. Even if a drug's approved, it's not the oversight of products does not end there. Both the drug companies and FDA have a commitment to continuing to evaluate the benefit risk profile, primarily through continuing to understand the evolving safety profile. As you can imagine, clinical trials only include so many people and they're only so long. So when the drug's then out on the market, they're being used by a larger number of people. They're going to be used potentially for people's lifetimes. And you're also including people that are now taking the drug that may not have been eligible for clinical trials. So there's some differences in terms of the patient population. So all of that can lead to learning more and seeing a different safety profile than was originally reviewed. And so FDA is always making sure that the benefits continue to outweigh the risks through this safety surveillance program. So now that we've I know that was very quick, we talked through how drugs go from basic science and discovering products that might have have some promise through non-clinical and clinical evaluation and how they eventually get approved. So that way your prescribers can actually prescribe them for you. But let's talk a little bit about exactly FDA's role in that. There's a few things that are important to note in terms of what FDA does and does not do. So when it comes to drug development and clinical trials, FDA does not develop drugs. So it's researchers, pharmaceutical companies, sometimes even nonprofit groups that are funding this research, at any of those various stages of development. Also, because FDA is not doing drug development, they're not actually doing the clinical studies. So they're not running studies, they're not on site for trials. It's really researchers that are, contracted or sometimes employed by drug developers that are conducting the trials, and they have to go and get FDA approval, and they'll meet throughout the drug development process to get FDA's input, which we'll talk about in a second. But ultimately, FDA is not the one that's picking what drugs get studied, what diseases or indications they're getting studied in. That is all driven by outside parties to determine what drugs to take forward. When it comes to drugs being on the market, FDA does not have authority to regulate the practice of medicine. So what that means is once they've approved a drug, they're regulating what the companies that market the drugs can say about that. So making sure that they're not marketing outside of their approval or what's consistent with their approval. So what they're not regulating is what doctors and other prescribers do. So doctors have freedom as part of their medical practice to prescribe something that's FDA approved for different uses. And this could just be a different age range. This could be a totally different disease than it's approved for. But this is called off-label use. And so the FDA doesn't have jurisdiction to kind of regulate what doctors do and how doctors use drugs. Another thing when drugs are approved is FDA is not involved in regulating the price of medicine or whether insurance companies will cover and provide access to medicines. FDA doesn't have any of that information. And even if they had price, they knew what the price was going to be. Under the law, they're not allowed to take that into account. So issues of drug pricing and access are also outside of the scope of the FDA. I've mentioned a lot of what FDA doesn't do. I want to mention that just because that FDA isn't involved in doing those things doesn't mean they don't play a really integral role. Not only are they the gatekeeper, but they do have as part of their mission to promote the public health. And what that means is that you can imagine these reviewers at FDA, they've seen every clinical trial, the results, both the failed as well as the successful. They have a lot of understanding of what works and doesn't work. And while they need information from all of you, like through this PFDD meeting, yeah, they also bring a lot of expertise and knowledge to the table. And so that way, when companies go and they meet with them, they can benefit from all of that experience and expertise. And that's exactly what they do. They have these numerous meetings throughout the drug development process to help provide that expert input to companies. So I've covered this very quickly, the process of drug development and regulatory decision-making. FDA has some great resources on this that are designed for patient stakeholders. So if you're interested, you can go to the webpage listed on this slide. But at this point, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Larry, who's going to walk through where your voice fits into all of this.
Thank you so much, James, for that great overview. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit now about the meeting that we are in the process of planning. So what is the purpose of this meeting? FDA had wanted a more systematic way to gather the patient perspective about different medical conditions and available treatment options. They realized when they were approving new drugs that they talked to scientists, doctors, drug developers, but there was an important voice missing, and that was the voice of patients, the people that were going to end up using the drug. So these meetings help to inform the FDA and their understanding of the context for benefit risk assessments and decision-making when they're trying to decide whether or not to approve a new drug. And patient input, it really helps the FDA during drug development as well as during their review of an application. So at the end of the stage of what James just shared with you, when they're trying to decide whether the new drug should reach market. Next slide. So a little bit, I just mentioned about a benefit risk assessment. So when the FDA is considering approving a new drug, they want to do an evaluation of what are the benefits that we think this new drug is going to have and what are the potential risks. Almost every drug on the market has a risk of some kind or another. So the way that they do this, they analyze the condition. What is the disease? What are the symptoms of the disease? How does it impact people's lives? And what are the current treatment options available? So are there a lot of treatments available, or is this a disease where maybe there are no approved FDA treatments? As far as the benefits and risks, they look at the clinical research studies that are completed by the drug companies. They see if it looks like the drug had any benefits for people with the disease and what were the risks. So what side effects did they see in the clinical studies? And they have to take all of this information when they're trying to make their decision. But our meeting is going to really help with these first two topics, the analysis of the condition and current treatment options. Next slide. So this is the Phelan-McDermid syndrome voice of the patient meeting. It's going to be a framework for discussing questions that came from the FDA. These are very similar to questions that the FDA used when they were doing these types of meetings. We have tailored our agenda and the panel questions to try to communicate the most important information we think for the FDA to learn about PMS. And FDA has told us that active patient involvement and participation is the key to the success of these meetings. So we really hope that all of you can join in on the actual meeting date. Next slide. So people say, well, what happens at the end of the meeting? So after the meeting's over, we will write up something called the Voice of the Patient Report. This will be a summary of all of the caregiver and audience testimony, as well as polling data that we collect and written comments that are submitted. It will all be collected into one paper where people can go and read about the meeting. This Voice of the Patient Report is a key communication to FDA review staff, as well as regulated industry and drug developers about what patients and caregivers most want to see in a treatment. And FDA has told us that this information really helps to inform them about ways to develop meaningful treatments for PMS. Next slide. So now, how do you participate in the meeting? Next. So who is this meeting for? It's a public meeting. We hope it's for PMS patients and caregivers, as well as FDA staff, pharma, biotech companies, and anyone interested in learning. You can invite friends, family, your doctors, anyone who might want to learn about PMS. It's going to take place on November 8th this year. It'll start at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and go till 3 o'clock p.m. in the afternoon. It's a virtual meeting, so people can attend anywhere in the country or actually anywhere in the world, and it'll be an interactive live stream. Next slide. So just to go over what is the agenda on the day of the meeting going to look like, we'll start off with a welcome and some introductory comments from the meeting co-moderator and the FDA. Then we'll hear from a clinical expert on PMS who's going to talk about, just to give everybody an overview of what is PMS and what are some of the major symptoms that they see in their clinical practice. Then we'll move into two topics. In the morning, we're going to talk about PMS symptoms and how those symptoms affect your lives. And then we'll take a break for lunch. And after lunch, we'll come back and we'll talk about how do you manage the symptoms? What are the current treatments that you're using? And what future approaches to treatment would you like to see? So some of the topics will have some pre-recorded patient panelists that have prepared panel statements in advance. We're going to have polling questions. There'll be instructions on the day of the meeting how to call in and answer the polling questions. And then we'll have a moderated discussion with the audience. And then at the end of the day, we'll have a summary and some closing remarks. Next slide. So what are some of the questions that we might ask of you on the day of the meeting? For the first topic, living with PMS, what are some of the symptoms and daily impacts? So maybe of all the symptoms of PMS, what 1 to 3 symptoms have the most significant impact on your life? How does PMS affect you on best and on worst days? And maybe describe what does a best day or a worst day look like? And then we want to know, are there specific activities that are important to you that you cannot do at all or as fully as you would like because of PMS? Next slide. So continuing on the same topic, we'd like to know if your symptoms changed over time. How has your ability to cope with your symptoms changed over time? And then what do you fear the most as your loved one gets older? What worries you most about your loved one's condition, and what frustrates you the most about your loved one's condition? Next slide. Then when we shift gears to talking about treatments and treatment challenges, we'd like to know, what are you currently doing to manage PMS symptoms? How well do these treatments treat the most significant symptoms of PMS? And what are the downsides to your current treatments, and how do they affect your daily life? And then also, we know everybody would like to have a cure for PMS, but short of a complete cure, what specific things would you look for in an ideal treatment for PMS? Next slide. So we're going to have a discussion format. As I said, there'll be some pre-recorded statements that will set a foundation for the broader audience discussion. Patients in the audience and patients and caregivers will have the opportunity to answer polling questions on their telephone. And then we're going to move to a discussion where people will be we'll ask people to call in to join and become part of the conversation. We really prefer that people call in. So on the day of the meeting, please consider picking up your phone and calling in to be part of what we're discussing. Next. So just a couple tips for how to participate effectively in the meeting. Remember FDA's role and the purpose of the meeting, as James had talked about earlier. Review these discussion questions in advance of the meeting. And if you have something important to share, relate it to the most appropriate topic or panel question, and then call in. And know that it's okay to reiterate a feeling or experience that somebody else has already brought up, even if it's similar to your own, but try to give it a personal or unique perspective. Try to keep your comments concise and focused. We have to hear from many people, and we want to hear from as many people as possible. And know that you can always send in additional comments after the meeting. Next slide. So you'll participate in the meeting by webcast. Your responses will be kept confidential. Here is the way to register for the meeting. It's on the CureSHANK website. As I said, we will accept written comments for up to 30 days after the meeting, and all of these comments will be included in the Voice of the Patient report that we submit to the FDA. Next slide. So in summary, this is your opportunity to be part of the process. Know that you can have a meaningful impact on clinical trial design and drug development for PMS. And your collective voices must be heard at the beginning of the process, at the very beginning, to help companies design trials that better meet your needs and to help the FDA when they're evaluating new treatments. So join us on November 8th and help make a difference. Next slide. So if you have any questions prior to the meeting, you can write an email to connect@cureshank.org and they will get back to you. Otherwise, we really look forward to you all joining us on November 8th. Next slide. So we have a few minutes left. We'd like to see if there are any questions. I think I'm going to ask Geraldine Bliss is going to rejoin us from CureSHANK.
Yes, so if you have any questions, we invite you to submit them. Again, there's the Q&A chat at the bottom of your Zoom. So you can type in any questions to us and we'll be happy to answer them. It can cover anything we've talked about, whether about drug development and FDA, this externally led patient-focused drug development program and how that your input is used, or anything specifically about the meeting itself. We're very happy to answer any questions. So again, yeah.
It looks like, yeah, we have a question. Yeah. We have a question already about who can participate. Oh, sorry.
That was the question. Who can participate?
Oh. Yeah, so as I mentioned, it's a public meeting. So it's not only for family members. It can be friends, acquaintances. If you work with someone that doesn't understand PMS that wants to learn, anyone is welcome to join the meeting.
Yeah, and there's been some related questions coming in saying, do you have to be a family member? If you have a caregiver, that is not, related, blood related, direct family, that's okay. Maybe you have, a close friend or a neighbor or actually, an actual caregiver, it's in the home and helping. If they want to participate and share, their personal experiences, and their relationship with your loved one, that they are absolutely welcome to. We do kind of consider that under the broad umbrella of who counts as a caregiver. What we're really making a distinction of is that we're not including, healthcare providers that provide healthcare services. We really want to hear that personal experience. And I know that we've seen someone wrote in saying, if my daughter has to work, can I, as the grandmother, attend and provide input? Yes, again, absolutely. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, close friends. Yeah, again, anybody that is involved in your loved one's life is very much invited to attend, and their input, even not just to view, but to share their insights, are welcome as well.
The next question.
And just a reminder that. Oh.
Go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that. So everybody that's like James said, that's a healthcare provider or FDA staff or drug companies, they're going to be in listening mode only. The only people that are participating in the discussion is going to be the family members.
Or caregivers.
So I see there's
caregivers, yes.
There's a good question. There's a question that came in that says a drug company needs to make money, but there are not that many PMS identified patients. Why would they want to go through all of that whole process for such a small population? And this is a great question. And It's one that, countries all around the world, including the United States, have struggled with over time is when there's not market incentives because populations are small, what can you do? And so, in addition to, whatever a company may be able to charge to help kind of recoup their costs and, as you rightly pointed out, also make money. There are other types of incentives to try to help, reduce the barrier to entry financially. There's orphan drug grants that the FDA administers. There's incentives. There's a 7-year period of exclusivity, meaning no other drug can be approved for the same the same drug. The same drug can't be approved for the same indication in that 7-year period. So it ensures that there's, some, market protections to give you a little bit more time to maybe recoup your money than you otherwise would be able to. So there are different types of incentive programs, and, those are always being reconsidered and reevaluated by Congress. So that does help. And it, and at least Larry and I have seen, there's lots of companies that have gone into very rare conditions and successfully made it through this process. So I'd say that, and I know that, as was mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, you do have some companies in the space that are really dedicated to your community.
There's a really important question that came in. Is there a printout to show the specific questions so that parents make sure they are answering the questions that are most needed? Can you kind of remind us how that process will work and what the opportunities will be for parents to chime in?
Yeah, Larry, do you want to take that or you want me to?
Okay.
Sure. So, on the day of the meeting, we will, at the beginning of each of the sessions, so in the morning session, at the beginning of that session, we will put the questions up so that you can review them once again. And then James will be the co-moderator of the meeting. First, we will watch the panelists' pre-recorded videos. And afterwards, James will begin to ask some questions. And at a certain point, he'll ask questions of the audience, of the people listening in. And so when you hear the question, like if James says, what symptoms are most important to you or have the biggest impact on your life, that's the topic we'll be currently discussing. There'll be a telephone number at the top of your screen, and you can call in and you'll be put into a queue. And we'll try to get to as many calls as we can so that you can join a live conversation with James.
Yes. Yeah, so that you don't have to worry and do pre-work and come up with anything. You are the experts in the types of questions we'll be asking. Certainly this recording and our slides will be available, and that lays out some of the broad discussion questions. But just know that, there's nothing there that you all won't be able to kind of know and be able to answer on the spot. And so don't feel that there's a lot of homework to do, so to speak, to participate. So there was a question that came in, it's kind of a comment / question talking about how every kid is so different in terms of their symptoms and whether how they experience PMS. And so the question was, what are we hoping a medication will do? Is it really to treat symptoms or really the whole PMS situation? Well, this is actually a really great question, because this is one of the things that we want to discuss with all of you at this meeting, which is to understand, one, how different those experiences can be. We can't assume that FDA knows that and understands that. And so that's why in the morning session, we're going to really understand all of those different symptoms and health effects so we can see how different that actually is. But then in the afternoon, when we focus on treatments, we're going to end the day asking about what would represent an important or meaningful treatment. And we want to know, would something that just treats a symptom but doesn't treat the underlying or the whole condition, is that something that actually, would be helpful or useful? We also want to know, things that maybe, impact the overall disease. What would, how would you evaluate that and make decisions in terms of whether you would want that for your kid or not? So these are actually, there is no one size fits all answer to that. And in fact, we want to hear from as many voices as possible to hear how each one of you thinks about that. And that will give FDA a good idea of the range of things that, if a drug or biological product were to come along, they can see that maybe multiple different things could be helpful here.
Yeah, there was another question about how did we select the pre-recorded panelists? So the pre-recorded panelists are a small number of people. There's 5 for the morning and 5 for the afternoon. They were selected to try to be a representative group, maybe people with, that have been newly diagnosed versus people that have been diagnosed for years. We tried to, there was another question about with, the large number of phenotypes in PMS, how are we going to cover this? And we're going to do the best that we can by hearing from as many different people, explaining, discussing their phenotype and what are the symptoms and the impacts that accompany it and what kind of treatments they use. So we're going to do as best we can to paint a picture of PMS from hearing as many voices as possible and seeing PMS from as many different angles as possible. But it's going to take all of you joining us to help make that happen.
I know there's a few more questions here, so we'll try to cover them, but while also being respectful of everybody's time as we're together this evening. So there was one question that was asking, how can we be randomized or have a randomized study for gene therapy, which is really, focused on, targeting specific patients. So a gene therapy can be studied in a randomized study, essentially by, you don't have to have a placebo that's a pill. You could have a placebo injection or however a product is administered. And so just like taking a sugar pill, patients, getting the one-time gene therapy versus the one-time placebo wouldn't know which they actually received and could then be randomized to those two, one of those two groups. Typically in gene therapy studies, they're called what are delayed start studies, meaning that even if you're assigned to placebo, there will be a time when you're converted over to gene therapy. And so, that kind of guarantees that everybody that participates, even if initially you're talking on about, or you're on placebo, that you could, still get the gene therapy. I don't know if others want to answer this, maybe knowing some specifics of gene therapy approaches in this community.
I think the answer is we don't yet know how the clinical trials will be designed yet.
Okay. There was another question, speaking of specific studies, someone asked if we could talk about a specific trial for a drug that's being studied. We're going to be spending the day listening to you and your story. So if you're a participant in a trial, that's part of your experience. So there'll be, when we get to the afternoon, we talk about treatments. It's fair game for you to say, I've been enrolled in such and such trial, and this has been my experience so far. So that is something we can discuss.
Yeah, so there's been some questions about providing information pre-meeting or post-meeting. So there will be an opportunity to submit written comments ahead of the meeting. So on that registration webpage, a couple of weeks before the meeting, there will be a comment form that will show up there. So that way, as you're, if you want to provide something ahead of time, that could be shared then during the live meeting date. You can also submit those written comments live during the meeting, in addition to what we hope you'll do, which is call in and participate in polling questions. If you're, whether you're at the live meeting and there's something you just didn't get a chance to say, or something you thought of after the fact, or maybe you can't make the meeting or the whole meeting, we will be also collecting those written comments for an additional 30 days after the meeting. So there will be that opportunity. Obviously, those comments won't be able to be read during the live meeting, but they will be included and incorporated into that voice of the patient report, which is an important document that will go to the FDA and be made available publicly.
And another question was, the pre-recorded panelists have already been selected. If you had volunteered and said, I would be willing to be a panelist, but you weren't selected for that role, please know that your story can be heard on the day of the meeting by calling in and joining the conversation or sending in written comments. We want to hear from everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Well, I think that we're going to probably conclude things for tonight, but obviously we know that a lot of you are going to have other questions that occur to you later. And so that connect@cureshank.org email that's in this is the way to ask questions. And also, as I said, you'll be receiving an email and also through social media the ability to watch this again if you wanted to.
We know it's been a lot of information for you all, and we're so grateful for everybody that attended tonight. Thank you so much. And I'd also like to just give a big thanks and shout out to Talia and Larry and James. Talia especially, you've done an incredible amount to bring this webinar to us all tonight. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to everybody for coming. And we look forward to talking to you some more.
Great. Thank you for having us.
Good night.
Take care.
Good night.
Night, everybody.